Welcome to the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. I hope this sounds and looks okay. I had to change computers, so I hope this actually works. Let me bring in my guests. I am joined with the one and only Warwick Powell. Warwick, I'm sorry for the delay. I had to actually switch computers, and so I'm hoping that this computer holds up okay over the course of this interview. How are you doing today? You doing okay this evening?
Yeah, not too bad. I'm glad that you've solved your technology problems. It's there's nothing more frustrating.
It's not off. The computer is like literally sitting right here. I'm hoping that I'm hoping it resolves. But thank you for joining me. I always appreciate you joining me. Just for the audience, just so they know who you are. Warwick Powell. He is an adjunct professor, Queensland University of Technology, chairman of Smart Trade Networks Group of Companies, president of Data Integrity and Supply Chains Association, Inc. Thank you for joining me, man. You wrote an article, and let me pull it up on this computer because the other one actually went down. I had to restart everything. But in essence, what you were making this argument was that people were making this argument that China was effectively a mercantile economy, that they were putting out more products than they were actually taking in. And the point of your article was to, as you typically do, go through numbers in order to show that these people they're complaining about their own failings. Basically, it seems that they're bothered more so by their incapacity to compete as opposed to this idea that China is exporting but not importing products. What's going on with this? Because you note a few people who are making this argument.
Yeah, look, this has been doing the rounds again. It has been for a while. You know, this idea that that China is exporting the world to death, and the kind of stories that are told is that Chinese manufacturers are represent so many percent of global outputs, etc., etc., etc. And the problem with this kind of story is that I think it fails to understand what's going on with trade to start with, and that is that trade is a dynamic process that really is a consequence of an evolving distribution of productive capacity, right? So the obsession about trade per se, in a sense, forgets that the first thing we should actually be much more interested in is the structure of production within an economic system. The second thing about these arguments is that they present a very narrow view of what constitutes trade, or at least the trade numbers that matter. In essence, it is entirely obsessed with trade in manufactured goods, and there is no doubt that China is the global leader in manufacturing, to a point where an American economist, Richard Baldwin, beginning of last year, actually wrote a piece that described China as the only manufacturing superpower in the world. So there's no doubt that Chinese manufacturing is a major part of the global economic scene. Chinese manufacturing basically produces things in every category of goods. Right? It's the only economy in the world that actually manufactures things in every conceivable category. Okay, so now that we've gotten that bit out of the way, we can then look at the bigger picture, and that is that China is also one of the biggest importers of things, and it imports agricultural products. So it's a net importer of foods. It's a major importer of energy, whether it's coal, oil, and gas. It is, of course, a major importer of services by way of education services, tourism services, software, movies, computer games. And so it is, and China is also a major importer, of course, of mineral products, raw materials. So the balance really isn't that significantly out of whack. The most important figure, firstly, to understand is that in terms of net exports, which is exports minus imports, net exports contributes less than 3% of China's GDP. So it imports stuff, it exports stuff. When you net them out together, what's left makes a very, very small contribution to China's overall economy. It's a less than 3% contribution, and it has been less than 3% now for the best part of the last decade. About 15, 18 years or so ago, it peaked at a much higher level where net exports was in the order of about 6 or 7% from memory of China's GDP, but it has been tapering off ever since. So Chinese imports have also been significant, all right? And now one of the claims is that China's import growth has plateaued. And that claim has been made on value terms. So in dollar value terms, over the last few years, Chinese imports have not really grown very much. And that's true. But in volume terms, when you want to measure it by tons and kilograms and units of things, across all of the major categories of imports, Chinese imports have actually grown. China imports also, by the way, aeroplanes, civil aviation, and semiconductors, right? So it continues to import a huge number of semiconductors, massive volume terms. So in a whole bunch of areas, Chinese firms, of course, continue to import lots of things. Now, what's important to understand about all of this is that Chinese exports have really experienced a very significant and rapid rise in a small number of categories, namely EVs, solar photovoltaics, and batteries. They're your big ones, as well as in the last couple of years, China's own semiconductors, right? So China is now exporting semiconductors in numbers that it certainly didn't do a few years ago. So the big growth in Chinese manufactured exports has been concentrated in a very, very small number of product categories. If you took those out of the equation, Chinese manufactured trade, balanced off against its imports of other things, is roughly on a par. So the bit that's really causing the anxiety, if you will, is actually these leading edge tech areas: EVs, batteries, solar PVs, and to some extent semiconductors. The other thing to bear in mind is that Chinese imports and exports are heavily related as well, not just as offsets, but in fact as a result of integrated supply chains. So many of the manufactures that Chinese companies make and sell, both domestically and into the overseas market, are possible because of the raw materials that are imported from all around the world. So the extent to which there is growth in volume in Chinese exports is also the driver of the growth in volume of Chinese imports of a whole bunch of these raw materials. So they're connected to each other. And so if people want to sort of run an argument that says, oh, China should reduce its exports but increase its imports, it actually doesn't make sense because of how integrated these supply chains are. And so the usual policy response, and this is the last little piece that I present in that article, is there's a line that basically says the RMB is undervalued, it should be revalued at least 10%. And the Financial Times actually had a piece earlier this week, or late last week, that talked about how China's RMB should revalue over the next 5 years by at least 50%. And the theory behind this is to make Chinese exports more expensive and to enable China to import more. The problem with this theory is that it assumes that all of the costs of China's exports are determined domestically. But in many of the things that China exports, particularly the things that I talked about, those high growth areas, the majority of the costs that go into those things is actually from imported inputs, which means that if you increase the value of the RMB, you're making it cheaper for those products to be manufactured. And it actually means that there's every likelihood that those products will actually be cheaper to the end consumer than they are today. So you've always got to be a little bit careful about what you wish for. You've really got to understand that in today's world, where supply chains are integrated and where Chinese manufacturing is really one node of complex processes, that involve imports and exports of raw materials and intermediate goods, that fluctuations in currency relative values may not necessarily deliver the textbook results that many people want. So, so basically, I say, Jamal, that the charge of mercantilism is somewhat misplaced. It's premised on a very narrow view as to what part of the trade equation matters. It really only talks about manufacturers. It ignores the fact that China remains a huge importer of all sorts of things. And it also ignores the fact that in volume terms, not in dollar terms, but in raw volume terms, China is importing continuing compound annual growth rate for the last 10 years of most of these things is over 3%. So, it's not insignificant. And I think people are a little bit, well, and maybe not intentionally, but certainly somewhat misleading when they get narrowly focused on one sector at the expense of what else is going on in other parts of the economic system.
I would say some of these people are intentional. Maybe that's me being cynical. Scott Bensent, for example, when he was making this argument that he just wants to help China, he wants to help them rejigger their economy where they can import more products because apparently our ability to compete has been undermined by China's, let's say, success in this. And this is, on some level, how China has made themselves a success, correct? This notion of exports, this idea that they can increase the amount
to an extent, but nowhere near as much as people say, right? So Chinese manufacturing basically exports about 20% of output, and that's declined over the years as well. It's sort of tapered at the moment. It's sort of plateaued at around 20% of output, bearing in mind that output's growing as well. So the domestic market's absorbing a greater volume of manufactured outputs, and roughly at about 80%. In some sectors, it's actually domestic market actually absorbs close to 90% of all things made. And I speak in particular about EVs. So EV production volumes have been growing tremendously, but the overwhelming majority of EVs that come off the production lines of Chinese factories are actually sold to Chinese buyers. So I guess one of the challenges for people is that China's a big place. It's 1.4 billion people. It's what's that? An eighth of the world's population. Its GDP is arguably 1/5 of the global GDP, if not even bigger. So it's large. But in proportionate terms, almost all of its economic activities are geared towards the domestic market, and I don't think China goes out of its way to be particularly mercantilist. So the idea of mercantilism is a conscious strategy to maximize exports, minimize imports, and China doesn't really do that. If it did, it wouldn't be importing the kinds of things that it currently imports. It imports these things, by the way, because for a lot of them, it needs to import them, whether it's for food security, whether it's for raw materials that are needed for other parts of the production system, and whether it's for discretionary expenditure, tourism and those sorts of things. Right? So China will continue to be an important market for products from all around the world. The fact that it's opened up its markets to over 50 African states in terms of zero tariffs is an example of that. It does need to enable the parts of the world that produce things to have access to the China market, and the Chinese government, I think, is more than happy for Chinese consumers to have access to all sorts of diverse things from around the world as well.
And by the way, I'm not saying part of China's success of being able to be an exporter is a negative. I mean, they've been able to draw 800 million people, a million people out of poverty. And part of that is people in factories, people incomes are going up, etc. But that doesn't mean that they're also not importing. So I don't want to make the argument that they're doing this without also importing products. That's not the argument that I'm making. I guess
Yeah, correct.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to show a disparity between the US, which is a consumer country, versus China, which has the ability to do imports and exports. I mean, for God's sake, their industrial capacity is astonishing. How does
And
this?
this goes back to that earlier comment that I made, which is that a lot of people who talk about these issues get really obsessed by trade. What they really should be looking at is the changing evolution of the production systems. Right? So if you looked at the composition of the American economy 50 years ago, it looked very different back then to what it does today. And as a consequence of transformations in the structure of production, it continues to meet the needs of its population. Companies are importing things that are made elsewhere. In fact, many of these companies relocated their production activities away from North America and then imported the production back to service the American consumer. So, these are the dynamics that have taken place over the years. China does have a very strong sense from a public policy point of view that economic systems are principally production systems, and it's production that drives the rest of the sort of circulation and the satisfaction of needs. And therefore, you've got to always focus on what's happening in your production part of an economy. Now, that's not to say that they sit on their laurels and go, well, we've sorted that. In fact, quite the reverse. What it does is that it's constantly driven by the idea that production needs to be made more efficient from an energetic point of view, time, and other factors of production. It is driven by the idea that intense competition, particularly in your more downstream sectors, is critical to ensuring that consumers in society get access to the best things at the best price. It also has a view that innovation is necessary, particularly upstream, for processes and technologies that will have an impact across an economy. So we've seen ongoing investments in scientific work around processing different metals, for example, or a whole lot of work in scientific labs around the material sciences. How do we make better use of materials to improve electrical conductivity, or to make stronger but lighter things, or what have you? There's a lot of investment in telecommunications technologies, both in a hardware sense, but also in a software sense, because there's an understanding that that's a bit of kit, if you will, that affects the whole show. And so there's a lot of commitment, at the innovation and research and development level upstream. And, these things are constantly in flux. China is a developmental state that has a very, I think, a colleague of mine in Brazil actually talks a lot more about this through the lens of very well-known political economist Schumpeter, who gave rise to the phrase creative destruction, right? And my colleague in Brazil will talk about China really as a Schumpeterian creative destruction kind of state, right? And that's a way of thinking about China's development. It certainly doesn't sit still. Competition's intense, massive commitments of public resources, financially and otherwise, to innovation. Infrastructure, of course, as everybody knows, is really in many parts of the country second to none now, and continuing to roll out. But all of that is in the name of enabling the production of what is in effect relative abundance. And once you've got relative abundance in the production system, you need to ensure that there is intense competition in the circulation or distribution networks to ensure that those goods get to people in the quickest and cheapest possible ways. And that, in some ways, is the sort of China story. The fact that there are exports is in some parts a byproduct of the capacity that it's built. And in the early days, so in the 80s and 90s, where there was more commitment to exports, a lot of that was to earn foreign reserves. But the other thing to remember about the exports, particularly in that time, is that the manufactured exports were largely undertaken by foreign firms that had set up factories in China. Okay, so it wasn't Chinese firms. Chinese firms exporting only overtook foreign firms that had set up factories in China and exported from China in the mid 2010s in terms of the value of their exports. So until about 8 or 9 years ago, most of the exports from China was actually undertaken by foreign-owned firms.
How do you compare this with America's economy? I mean, at some point we switched over to a consumer economy, and
Look,
this
yeah, consumer, services, and financial sector, right?
financialization, right, as opposed to industry.
Financialization. Yeah. So financialization was really the emergence of an industry which manufactured financial products, you know, things that you could invest in that would deliver you a monetary return. But they weren't necessarily things that made anything. Okay, so that's financialization, things that you could trade, stocks, derivatives, bonds, options and what have you. So that's a big part of the contemporary American economy. The sort of explosion of finance is actually a driver of monetary wealth creation. Services, of course, has been the other big part. So finance, of course, is often seen as part of the services economy, but other parts of the services economy have grown as well. And we know from a straight GDP accounting point of view, services like healthcare have really ballooned, representing about 16% of US GDP. Now that's remarkable because the global average is about 9.5, 10%. So the healthcare sector in the US has really ballooned in terms of its relative financial value. That's not to say it delivers value for money. Okay. In fact, it's well known to be one of the most expensive healthcare sectors in the world, but it does dominate a large part of the American economy these days. Private education is another classic case in point. Incredibly expensive in financial accounting terms, but it's basically an education, right? So the American economy has tilted very much towards the services sector. It has seen a hollowing out over the last 40 years of what I would call the mundane elements of domestic industry. The things that people would have and I guess continue to have a day-to-day experience with, whether it's clothes or the furniture that we have in our homes or the tools that we use, around our homes, the crockery, the linen, and all the things that make up our daily lives. Increasingly, those things are not made in the United States. And they're certainly not made in factories that are close to where people live. And in some respects, if you think back 50, 60 years, many of the things that people had in their homes were made in factories, at least within their state. Right? That just doesn't happen anymore. So financialization, a hollowing out of those sort of everyday manufacturing, I guess, is the other part. But I think that there's one more feature that's worth touching upon, and that is that ever since the early 2000s, we've seen the financialization of households as well. So we've seen an evolution of the structure of a household's income and expenditure and its assets and liabilities in a way that has seen American households become increasingly indebted, right? And this was the idea that earned income, the single wage or the two wages, was insufficient for the quality of life that an American should have and aspire to, but that could be solved through the provision of private credit. And so American households from the early 2000s onwards began to have marketed to them a whole range of financial products. Of course, credit cards, we know, but loans for cars, loans for home improvements, loans for holidays, loans for, well, just about anything and everything, right? And of course, yeah, and now we have, buy now, pay later schemes, which is a more recent variation of all of this. But American households have actually become increasingly indebted, and these three features, I guess, of the American political economy contrasts very significantly with the structure of the Chinese political economy.
China, like renting houses, I mean, you can even go into medical debt, right? Like medical debt is another one where you have to pay over a period of time for a hospital visit or hospital stay. I mean, God, man, there's so many of these things that you can't necessarily pay for all in one go. How does China deal with this? And this can be the last question because I don't want to keep you late.
That's all right. Look, healthcare in China is principally delivered through the public sector. And there is a small but emerging private health part of the Chinese healthcare system, but the dominant part of the healthcare system is public provision. It's also heavily geared towards hospitals. So hospitals have been a traditional feature of how healthcare gets delivered, which means that, so rather than having local doctors, spread through suburban practices, China has big hospitals in their cities and towns, and whenever people get sick, instead of going to see your local doctor, they actually end up going to the hospital. Right, so the service delivery model has historically been a little bit different. One of the challenges of that model is that it has heavily focused on how does it resource the supply side. So during the course of the last 15 or 16 years, the efforts have gone into either trying to get more nurses, trying to hire more doctors, trying to build more buildings and those sorts of things, particularly big hospitals. So how do we make the hospitals bigger? How do we enable the hospitals to handle more patients? There's one of the big hospitals in Shanghai, for example, receives 10,000 presentations a day at the emergency, right? Now, that a lot of those, by the way, are people who come from out of town. They want to see a doctor, and they think the doctor in town, in the big city, is a better doctor than the one from the smaller town. But they also will go there because they've got a cold, right? They've got a common cold, common flu, because there hasn't been a structure of medical delivery that involves a network of general practitioners. I think that model is going to evolve, and in part it will evolve because of the development of technologies. So diagnostic technologies, sensing data, where you can have data, devices that track your health status. All of this stuff is going to enable a more targeted, distributed system of triage. So instead of somebody getting a sniffle in their nose running off to the hospital, the aim will be that when they get a sniffle on the nose, that they will in effect self-diagnose or be diagnosed by data, fever, heart rates, body temperature, etc., etc. And it's those sorts of systems that I think will evolve to better manage demand, actually, right? Health is a very interesting area because doesn't matter how expensive it is, people will, use it because it involves life and death. Right? Yeah. So the real aim is to manage demand, to reduce pressure on the system at large, and ensure that people who are genuinely sick with particular kinds of ailments are able to gain the attention that they need in a timely way, instead of having the queue, in a sense, clogged up by people who don't need to be in the queue.
Yeah. What about homes? I mean, because as you pointed out, America's credit cards, healthcare bills, home bills, cars, cell phones, like you can go down the list of things that people effectively these financialized products, but you can't necessarily get away from. How does China do that? Like, do they do this in a different way to cut expenses where these aren't necessarily liabilities that their people, citizens, are stuck with? Or
look, there have been some experiments in the last 10 years with retirement village models that came from the United States and even from Australia. I don't think they've been entirely successful, and there will need to be, I think, more reforms around the delivery of social services for the graying population. And I'm not, so a lot of people historically, of course, in Chinese family environments grow old at home, and they're looked after by their children and their grandchildren. That's not as easy these days because more and more younger people no longer live near their parents, and they have moved to a bigger city for work or what have you. And there is, I think, quite a lot of social and economic disruption that's taken place because of these changing patterns of work and separating families from hometowns, where new models of aged care in particular is going to become necessary. And that is going to create, by the way, new industries, right? At-home care is going to become actually a really important industry going forward in China's own services sector, combined with robotics and sensors. And I think that they're the kinds of things that the Chinese state at large, and also different provincial and city governments, are looking at to deliver healthcare and aged care in reasonably affordable ways.
Wait, you said robotics. Oh,
Yeah.
so you're thinking like these human-shaped robots delivering? Yeah. Really?
Oh, not just delivering things, but actually being in-home help.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm saying. Like
yeah.
that's mind-blowing on some level. Like that's very futuristic. Because I've seen them. I mean, the software apparently is not necessarily up to date in order to kind of do that stuff yet. But you're foreseeing this kind of artificial general intelligence where these things are able to
I've got
pretend
here
to be human beings.
I mean, I'm not going to flog a particular product, but this is an ear set, and it's with some colleagues of mine who've been working on this technology. And it's very clever in the sense that it's built into your ear set, and it emits LED light, and it gets the reflection back from inside your ear where there's lots of blood vessels and stuff, and then it takes that data and then through its algorithms delivers outputs on your body temperature, blood pressure, blood oxygen, and a couple of other key metrics. Now, that was originally developed, and the reason why I brought it up, one, it was just sitting on my desk, but is that it was developed by somebody who wanted more effective, non-invasive, real-time monitoring of old people, such as his parents, where you could have very early warnings of somebody who may, in the next hour, have an episode. So this really starts to give you very grand, whether they would fall, but it was also to be able to detect that they'd fallen, all those sorts of things. So these are things that people are concerned about, and they're using technology as a way of intervening. They're also using technology as a way of ensuring that people receive the right scripts of medication and that they take the medication. So that's always been a bit of a challenge, is making sure that an older person takes the right things, right? And we all know the little boxes with Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's two big brothers for me. I hate that.
Right.
Like that's one of the things I hate, actually, because it's like there's some drug companies that are saying, yeah, we're creating products to ensure that people forcibly take the products. Okay, what if the person doesn't want to take the product? They go to the doctor and they blow the doctor off. I think the doctor's full of it.
And look, of course, there's also a lot of Chinese medicine re-emerging too, and the sort of integration. So, biotechnology is one of the fastest growing areas in China now. Biotechnology, biopharmaceuticals. In fact, it's understood to be, a lot of focus has gone into China's work in AI, what it's done in engineering, what it's done in battery technologies, and all these other things. But the big frontier now, where Chinese research and development has really taken the global lead, is in biopharmaceuticals. And so we are going to see, that's largely driven by low costs of production for making stuff, chemistry and things like that. But also the fact that China has a critical mass of medical researchers and bio researchers and people who, really diverse, right? So people who are doing, genetic analytics all the way through to people who have incredible knowledge in botanicals, right? Herbs and that sort of stuff, and actually really understanding the the chemical properties of these botanicals. Through traditional Chinese medicine, there was a view that X, Y, and Z would be useful for whatever. But now they're really getting into trying to figure out what the causal connections are and why it is that certain herbs or roots or what have you do have these beneficial effects on particular ailments. And I think we're going to start to see incredible developments in these frontiers as well.
I would tell you, the robot thing concerns me a little bit. Like, there was always this belief that regardless of the jobs that are lost, like across the board, whether it's in diagnostics, whether it's in software, comp sci, whatever, that you can never replace the person. Like, meaning a human touch, dealing with a person that's, let's say, elderly or child or something to that effect, is on some level irreplaceable. That may not be the case, though. I've seen these robots that are coming out from China. And yeah, they look a little weird now, but what does it look like in 20 years? And what does it look like when you get software that can, let's say, perform various duties that a person may not necessarily want to do, or at the very least is capable enough to function in those places where they don't have a child, where they don't have the capability of paying for, let's say, a nurse or something like that. You can kind of see it. I mean, even now, in the way that the robotics have evolved over the course of time and the dexterity of those robots, it's amazing. It's very amazing.
Yeah, look, I think that there are good reasons to, I guess, tread warily into this space. Not only in a physiological sense, it's quite amazing where the developments are going in terms of the dexterity and all of that. But I think the real frontier is going to be in the area of how do these robots successfully emulate human interactions, right? And that's the empathy issues and the context and all of that. And and for the time being, anyway, I think we're still, as humans, reasonably safe ground. AI still has a long way to go before it can do all of that. And if you're dealing with children or old people, I think there is something about the empathy that people can actually have and sense, and only have that through the sort of development of a relationship that you have with somebody that you spend time with over time. And but no doubt people working in the AI space will be exploring how they can, at the very least, emulate that so that it appears that the robot is empathetic and all those things, even if, of course, they aren't.
Please let me get one more question in. And extrapolate for me on this very specific point. Whether it's with AI doing various jobs, I mean, even large language models have gotten to the point where they're dumb, but kind of not. Like, it just kind of depends on what you ask it, right? And even like with YouTube videos, like when you would like titles, descriptions, like all of this grunt work that you don't necessarily want to do, where you can analyze a video and then spit out a description. Okay, well, it saves a huge amount of time. And that's not just with this, that's with the web service. Like, for example, in CompSci, my old company, when the first company that I worked with as a software engineer, I remember they used to say, well, we used to make like $1 million off of a contract. And over the course of, let's say, 5 years, that number went down to like 100,000, because for the most part, there were so many tools and so much of the work that just became, let's say, grunt work that was automated, that you didn't need to spend that much money anymore. In which case, the amount of money that the company made went down as a direct result of the tools that were being built. This was before AI has even became a thing. And I know for myself, at the company that I used to work at, the auto company, I built systems that eliminated jobs. Like, it was just stuff that software could do better than human beings, that they had human beings doing, where they had to move people over to somewhere else because they didn't need them to do that task. That was basic. And so, like, you can look and say, okay, well, what does this look like in 10 years? When truck drivers no longer need jobs, when Uber is automated, when Android or robots bring things to your house, so you don't necessarily need an Uber driver to bring things to your house. These are classes of jobs that are just going to evaporate. I don't know how America is going to deal with this, because we don't necessarily have a system that is in place to even contemplate this issue. From my point of view, if you're not working, you're a lazy bum. You deserve to down the street without healthcare. How does China deal with this? Because they're also going to run into this, especially since a lot of what they're using AI for is not military in the way that the US is using it. It's for infrastructure and those type of things. Like, it's how do we make our products faster, cheaper? How do we use less energy? How do we use less human capital, etc.? How are they going to deal with this issue? Because they're going to run into it, I would argue, faster than we are.
Well, in many ways, of course, the issues are no different, because things that human beings used to do won't be things that humans will do. Now, this, of course, has been a recurring theme of human history, particularly in the post-industrial period, right? So since industrialization 300 or so years ago, we've constantly been going through episodes of job replacement as new technologies come in. But at the same time, we also know that that causes new things to emerge. If there's one thing humans are particularly good at as we solve problems using things like technologies, is that in the act of solving one problem, we usually create at least two new ones and maybe 3 or 4 others that we don't even know about. And in that sense, we will continue to create work for ourselves. The sort of driver of humans, humanity as creative beings, I think, does leave a space open for the ongoing need for humans. But I also reflect a little bit on some of the discussions in the 1920s when there was optimistic talk that mechanization, before automation, big factories, would lead to abundance and would ultimately enable people to have a lot more leisure time. Right? So I don't have to work 5 days a week. Society only needs people to work 2 days a week, and we'll have a lot more time to pursue all sorts of other pursuits, leisure and hobbies and other things that are meaningful to us. That's an optimistic view of that. And I think whether or not we have an optimistic end outcome or a more dystopian end outcome is going to come down to how states and governments, as expressions of the expectations and hopes of the people, ultimately govern the distribution of the surpluses that emerge. Right. So, if you've got a robot that can do the work of 10 people, we literally have a whole lot of surplus now. So the question is who gets it? What does that surplus do? How does that contribute to social well-being? Or is it a surplus that's accumulated by, one person, and 9 people can sort of, forget about it? And that does come down to how societies organize themselves. China does have a much stronger ethos around this sense of public goods, and the idea of state-owned enterprises being important parts of the economic system, I think, will help China deal with some of these issues easier in some respects, because it knows that it's got a history of not letting people fall through the cracks too far. I think the challenge for North America is, of course, it does have a cultural outlook that says, well, if you're unemployed, it's your fault, right? And if there's lots of you, too bad. And that's going to become, I think, a political and social challenge, which really just amplifies the problems that, we've touched on not only earlier today, but also in our previous discussions as well.
Yeah. Warwick, thank you for this. Thank you for letting me be in your ear. I'm always learn something in these conversations, and hopefully the audience does also. I really appreciate it. And your articles are fantastic, just so the audience can see the latest. There's a lot of dogs here, unfortunately. I will be leaving here soon.
We let the dogs out.
Yeah. Unfortunately, they always let the dogs out, and they're often unkept and just kind of roam the place. It's wild, right? You go from one location that is that believes dogs are dirty, but for religious reasons, and so you never see dogs. You only see cats, and you see the random cat that's taken care of that is like lounging near the laundromat. And then you come to a country where it's the opposite. I've seen no cats in Nepal. You've seen dogs everywhere. It's so weird. It's just such a culture shift. But this is the article that he came up with, McCarthy 2.0, China's economic structure, trade patterns, Western mercantilist simulacra. Definitely check his Substack out. Cool. You have fantastic articles on your Substack page. And so the audience will know who you are if they don't at this point. Dr. Warwick Powell, he's adjunct professor, Queensland University of Technology, chairman of Smart Trade Networks Group of Companies, and president of Data Integrity and Supply Chain Association, Inc. Dr. Powell, thank you for this, man. You be safe, okay?
You too. Have a great one.
Have a good one. Bye-bye. All right. I am waiting on Alex Krainer. He hit me up and said he was getting a 404 page. I resent him the link. So hopefully he retries. Let's see. Let me know if that works. I know it works because I sent it to Warwick and Warwick showed up. So let's hope that we can get Alex on the page. My computer's pissing me off. I'm sorry, it pisses me off. Like, it does these sneak updates, even when you tell it don't update. And the moment that it updates, it damages the microphone. So the microphone doesn't work with the update, and it does it every time. And so the update always needs to be uninstalled. And so the computer is effectively a time capsule. And it works, providing it doesn't do that. I have two computers with me, in part for this very specific reason. If anything happens to one, I always have the other one where I can always get another one in time and use this as a leeway or as a gateway between the two. Let me check and see if Alex has responded. Oh, Alex. All right, I hope I hope there's no issue with that. And I don't have this text message, so I can't necessarily hit him directly on this. But I will say this, and I pull these up. Witkoff meets Putin. There's that. At the same time, he's meeting Putin. Oh, good. Alex, can you hear me, my man? How you doing this morning?
I can hear you, Jamal. How are you?
I am doing fine. Had a bit of technical glitches earlier today, but
yeah, did StreamYard crash or what happened?
I don't know. I didn't have an issue with Warwick getting on. I saw your thing. I resent the link, and resending the link seemed to solve the issue. So the world is good. I'm going to go with that.
So it was maybe the link got bent out of shape.
Yeah, the link was having issues. It was complaining for some reason. We are joined with the man himself, Alex Krainer. He is founder of Krainer Analytics and creator of iSystems Trend Following. He has worked as a market analyst, researcher, trader, and hedge fund manager since 1996. He has authored several books, including Mastering Uncertainty in Commodities Trading, The Grand Deception, and Alex Krainer's Trend Following Bible. And I'm always appreciative when you join me on this. You had an interview with Glenn Deason that I was fascinated by. And you've said this in the interviews with me also, and I'm very curious on your take on this idea that we are reaching into a new world, that regardless of how the world seems currently, that it seems static on some level, that's not really what's taking place underneath, that things are shifting, and they're shifting in a way, in part because Europe is effectively losing its capability to control and manage the political economy that it had been for the last 100, 200, X hundred years, that it's been able to control, let's say, the masses of the planet. Break this down for me in a political sense and break this down for me in an economic sense. And we can start with the politics first.
Well, depending on how you define it, how you cut it, we've had, for the last 5 or 6 centuries, we lived in a very Eurocentric world. What I mean by that is that Europe was the center of the world in terms of culture, finance, economic development, and even in terms of political developments, diplomacy, and military. And so the European model converged on, the model of political governance, converged on something that invariably manifested colonialism, imperialism, imposing itself on the rest of the world. Not just militarily, not just economically, but also culturally. And I think that trend escalated until our days, where it came to the point where everybody had to submit to this monoculture that we imposed. You have to be like this, you have to impose a democracy, you have to effect judicial reforms, you have to introduce these economic measures, you have to open your markets, you have to have LGBT parades, freedom of the media, which in really means you have to let us buy up your main corporate media outlets and control them, and on and on and on. And so little by little, they were turning humanity into like a monoculture based on the same principles applied everywhere. And so I think that this is probably the peak Europe, which I think is now giving way to a shift where the gravity of global development is shifting eastward. Now the process is obvious now, but it didn't just start. I think that the wars we're observing is the culmination. It's some kind of an inflection point where things are changing, but the people who are in charge in Europe, the people who are the key beneficiaries of the status quo, are fighting to retain their power, are fighting to stay in charge and to not let these processes unfold. They're trying to reverse this change. And so you have all these discontinuities, like war in Ukraine, war in the Middle East, all these crisis flashpoints that are attempted to get activated again, like the Kashmir, Azerbaijan, Armenia, the Balkans, and so forth. But I think that the tide is turning irreversibly. I think that changes that are happening are very robust. They're very deep-rooted. And the people who are trying to reverse them are a relatively small segment of Western populations. I mean, not relatively. I think that they're very, very small segments of the Western populations who have their loyalists in the social hierarchy who carry water for them. But I think that the level of conviction is very, very low. I think that largely European Western population in general are disillusioned with the existing systems, and they're not inclined to fight for them. And so the tide is turning away from Europe. And I think that in this process, the United States is kind of seeking to establish their own self-identity, which they never really did properly. The United States started as a reaction to European colonialism, it was a rejection of the European colonialism. But I think that it was once the United States won their independence, the attempts from the European side, particularly the British Empire, to bring the United States back into their fold never stopped. Colonial wars didn't work. The Civil War in 1960s didn't work. but the slow grinding process of infiltration, penetration of the American ruling structures, and the co-opting of American system did yield results. And then, the United States turned into this basically part of the Western Empire, the most visible and the most powerful part of the Western Empire, which kind of makes it look like we're dealing with an American empire, really. But I don't think we are. I think we're dealing with an empire which is maybe reincarnated in the United States, but which originates from the still undead British Empire. And so now that under the Trump administration, the United States seems to be seeking a new course, you see the reaction on the European side. All these old colonial powers, primarily Britain and France, are simply hysterical because they lost their global cup. They sense that the global cup is, off to greener pastures, which is happening. And so I think that, yeah, go ahead.
No. I was just saying interesting. I mean, because there is this, in the old days, like in Europe, they used to have these wars back and forth. And it was just like Europe would attack, like, let's say France and Britain would be at each other's throats. Germany would get involved. France would get involved. France would attack Russia. Russia would respond. And, as America was generated and created, we ended up engaging in something very similar in regards to getting involved in European wars also. And there's this question of like, why is it that the world continues to just be at each other's throats with these kind of wars that go back and forth, back and forth? You can make an argument that that's something that we effectively took from Europe. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just saying interesting, but please continue.
Well, when you say we took from Europe, it's not really take as in like, hey, we like this about the Europeans. Let's let's join the party. The Europeans frequently engaged in wars that were too much for them to handle on their own. So they always sought the participation and reinforcement from the United States. For example, World War I was almost completely orchestrated by the British ruling elites. They co-opted the French and the Russians and the Belgians, basically with the ultimate objective of destroying Germany, because Germany, starting from the 1870s, rose up as the most credible and most powerful threat to British hegemony over the entire planet. And so, the people who were running the place in London decided, okay, we need to destroy Germany, but we can't destroy her on our own. So let's get the French to fight the war for us, and let's get the Russians to fight their wars for us. And they got the Belgians into the picture, and then they even managed to turn Italy against Germany and Austria-Hungary, even though Italy was formally allied with them. And then, Germany was still a very, very formidable enemy. And so they decided that they need to bring the United States into the fold. So there was this whole big, giant plan where they brought Woodrow Wilson to power in the White House. He even ran on the promise not to get the United States involved in European wars. Then they orchestrated a false flag event with the sinking of the Lusitania. Not false flags in the sense that they sunk Lusitania themselves, but they basically made sure that the Germans sunk it. And then that happened. And then they started even before the Lusitania, they were, they already had control of the American media. And so the campaign of demonization of Germany had ramped up to very high levels of intensity. But then after Lusitania, and then a bunch of American citizens got killed when the ship sank. Then they started the big campaign to say, okay, we have to get involved in this war. Now we're we need to avenge. We need to to bring justice, blah, blah, blah. We need to make the world safe for democracy and all this. And so the United States joined World War I. Similar scenario played out with World War II. Again, the American people were not interested in fighting a European war. But again, European interests were lobbying hard to get that done. And then, the resistance was finally broken with Pearl Harbor, which was a false flag attack. Again, not a false flag attack as in, they did it themselves, but they pressured and provoked Japan so unscrupulously and so harshly that it was just a matter of how and where and when the Japanese were going to lash out and attack. So when that happened, then they were like, okay, well, we've been attacked. We have to go to war now. And so there's a risk that happens again now because, the Europeans are bending over backwards to get themselves into trouble that they cannot handle themselves. Europe stands no chance in a war against Russia. But what the Europeans can do is get themselves into a world of trouble. And then when they get their nose bloodied, they're going to turn to the United States and say, oh, look what the Russians did to us. You can't possibly leave us by ourselves. You are our daddy and you have to come and defend us. And then, the media in the United States, which are still largely British controlled, maybe they're totally British controlled, I don't know. They're going to start ramping up the propaganda of evil Russians beating up on the poor Europeans. And, these are our traditional allies. And most of our nation has been built by immigrants from these countries. And we are the same flesh and blood, blah, 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 blah. You can imagine all the stories that are going to be played, Russian soldiers bayoneting toddlers in Poland or I don't know what. And then, another little false flag attack somewhere. And there you go. Once more, the United States gets dragged into another global conflict on the European continent. That's the danger. But I think that, unlike World War I and World War II, several things have changed. I think that the gravity of global economic and technological development have already shifted to East Asia and to an extent to Russia as well. And then we also have the internet, which I think has completely changed the narrative control equation. And so I think that what's going on now is just basically the dying agony of the old system while the new system is being born. And, I always go back to the Confucian saying that when the large tree falls, it falls with great noise and destruction. Mm-hmm. Seeds grow in silence. Seeds make no noise when they grow. I think we're kind of living through a version of that. The old obsolete systems in the world are collapsing, and that is generating this noise and destruction, and it's attracting our attention, practically mesmerizing everybody. You're just seeing horrible things going on in the world. But what you don't see and what doesn't attract our attention is these seeds that are growing without a question, because they grow in silence, because, things are happening by people just minding their own business. Except, at a higher level, that's making a huge, example. Mm-hmm. The Chinese built like 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail networks.
Yeah.
Russians breaking new grounds with technological advancements that, that simply didn't exist before. I've recently come across the story of Azerbaijan building, 4,000 in the space of less than 5 years, building 4,000 kilometers of highways, hundreds of bridges, tunnels, viaducts, and so forth. And this is happening everywhere. This is happening in Africa, in all of the global South. It's just that Europe and the Western world is kind of stuck um, like an old, broken noble family that refuses to give up their status and that want to use every means possible to make people still bow down to them and revere them and take orders from them and so on, except, the world is moving on. And I think that we're living in this moment. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, what does it mean for the world to move to the east? Like for, let's say, the countries of, let's say, BRICS, for example, Russia, China, Iran, etc., seeming to be able to defend themselves. There's that. But
they're going to do what to themselves?
They are able to defend themselves, meaning they're able to defend their sovereignty in a way that may not necessarily have been true in the past. I guess what does it mean for the world to move to the east in this case? How does the world change?
Well, it means that instead of being completely dependent on Western technologies, Western financial centers, Western capital for your nation's development and trade with the rest of the world, that you will now have an alternative, that you will be able to trade with China, with India, that you will be able to plug into their trade settlement systems and possibly new reserve currencies, that you no longer have to abide by the diktat of the IMF and the World Bank, that you no longer have to trade everything for US dollars and then, have your proceeds deposited at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York or in European bank centers. So you have an alternative that hasn't existed in our lifetime. You had to, if you wanted to trade with the rest of the world, if you didn't want to be like North Korea, completely isolated, like the autarky, you simply had to compromise with the West in a lot of ways. You had to open your markets to Western corporations, Western banks. You had to take policy recommendations from the IMF, introduce structural reforms and austerity and loans. You had to be in debt up to your eyeballs to Western financial institutions. And the result is that much of the rest of the world remained almost chronically impoverished, which was by design. It's not an accident. It's by design, because the Western model has always been resource extraction. And if your model is resource extraction, then you want those resources at the lowest possible price.
Right.
And if the local economies of these resource exporting countries grow and develop, then they're going to be using up those resources at home, which means that you're going to have to compete with their domestic economies. So in order to eliminate their competition, you just keep them piss poor, so that they cannot afford to refine their own oil, that they cannot afford to refine their own gold, that they don't use any of those resources in developing their own, infrastructure and industries, that they don't try to compete with you in terms of advanced finished products and so forth. This has been a model. The Chinese model is completely different. They want, they've positioned themselves as the world's manufacturing hub. And so they want a large market of prosperous people who have purchasing power to be their customers. If you want to sell cars, clothes, appliances, computers, phones, whatever, you want people to have money to spend. And so they've been doing this in the same way that they've raised 850 million Chinese people out of poverty over the last 40 years. They want to do the same with the rest of the global South. And they're doing it. I think in 2023 or 24, I forget, another 200 million affluent consumers have been added to the global economy. And that's some kind of a benchmark which is maybe when per capita disposable income reaches a certain level, I think maybe $5,000 a year. And then these people are considered affluent consumers, which means they have money to spend. So that's the strategy, opposed to the Western colonialist strategy, which deliberately wanted to keep them poor and underdeveloped so they never compete with our industries. So you extract resources from them, you pay them cheap money for it, and then you bring your own finished product and technologies to take that money back from them. So they're always broke, basically. That was the model. And that model is changing. And that new model is obviously being promoted by China, basically, but it's been adopted by the BRICS movement. It's the defining philosophy of the Belt and Road Initiative. And now, the majority of world population, a huge chunk of the global GDP, are already on board with the BRICS and multipolar integrations. And what I mentioned, when I mentioned the United States looking for its identity, I think that even the United States is starting to turn in that direction.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious on how, and I guess there are two questions with this. How does Trump going after Venezuela fit into this? Or does it fit into this?
I don't know. I don't know, Jamal. I'm perplexed. It looks awful. It looks very ugly. But the reason I say I don't know is because I absolutely cannot buy the ostensible reasons for it. Like fighting the narco trafficking. I don't think anybody buys that, because
it's BS.
We're going after drug cartels. Your target number one would be the money laundering banks. Your target number two would probably have to be Canada. Your target number three would probably have to be Mexico, and then Ecuador.
Mm-hmm.
Venezuela would probably be one of the last places you would attack for fighting drug cartels.
Right.
Then there's the oil angle, which is more convincing, but even there I have my doubts, because if I interpret Trump correctly, going for Venezuelan oil would effectively use the resources of the U.S. taxpayers. So U.S. military, lives and limbs of U.S. servicemen, and huge expense of fighting a regime change war at great risk, because there's a great deal of things that could go wrong. In order to give a present, a massive multi-trillion-dollar present on a silver platter to Wall Street and City of London bankers. So that doesn't fit the way I see Trump. I might be mistaken in the way I interpret Trump, but that's the way I see it. So I don't buy that angle, the oil angle, that this is why they're doing it. Now, if Trump said, like, no, we're going to take that oil and it's going to become part of our sovereign asset fund, then I think, like, okay, maybe. But just to give to Wall Street, I don't think that's what's going on. And so then, we're looking at things that nobody's talking about outside of the alternative universe, where people are openly discussing conspiracy theories, because it's not one of the things that are being talked about openly, so it's got to be something else. So what else could it be? Well, I myself have, I recall that when Russia went to war against Ukraine in 2022, the Biden administration decided to go back to Caracas and negotiate some kind of a deal because they felt that they might need access to Venezuela's heavy oil. So then there were some negotiations that we don't know everything about. At any rate, Biden administration dropped sanctions against the Maduro regime, or at least some of them, and they've done some kind of wheeling and dealing that may have ultimately resulted in Venezuela emptying their prisons into the United States. Like they basically got the worst of Venezuela and shipped them over to the United States because, one of the Biden's things was this heavy-handed forcing of immigrants into the United States. And apparently that happened because now the Venezuelans are taking these people back, which in a way is an admission that, yeah, in fact, that kind of did happen. And then, there have been these kind of spurious accusations that this Smartmatic and Dominion voting systems were being run out of Venezuela, that they had, I don't know if they had software developers, teams or servers or stuff like that, and that they played some kind of a nefarious roles in making sure that US elections can be manipulated at somebody's request, and that somebody must have been, related to the DNC. And then you obviously had the very heavy involvement of the CIA with the Venezuelans. And I happen to know a little something about this because I met a person who was a special forces, like commander type soldier in Bosnia, and who told me that he very frequently goes to Venezuela and that they do dirty work for the Maduro regime. When I asked him what kind of dirty work, he said, well, it's mostly arms. He didn't say drugs, but he said arms smuggling. They were delivering arms and technologies to the Maduro regime. Anyhow, there's certain something there, and I wonder if Trump isn't forcing Maduro and his people to heal, to turn over the receipts against the CIA, against the deep state in the United States, and against the allies of the DNC. And we'll find out. Sorry?
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, is it possible that Marco Rubio is a neocon? Trump has surrounded himself with neocons, and even in Trump's first term.
Yeah, that's possible. That's definitely possible. But I don't see it as plausible that Marco Rubio would just get his personal pet project and that he could deploy the U.S. airstrike carrier groups to pursue his pet project.
Okay.
That would be like the last line of explanations that I would pursue. At any rate, we'll find out. I have to say that when this thing with Venezuela started, I always thought there wouldn't be a war. And the reason why, not because Trump is a nice man, but because it's too stupid. I think you and I talked about the war on Iran, and I thought
Yes.
that would be so dumb. It's either not going to happen or there's going to be a fake war. And I think the same of Venezuela. All these morons that are, like Lindsey Graham and others that are talking, oh, it's going to be a layup. It's so easy. Maduro regime is going to fall like nothing. They just very recently got their butts handed to them by the Taliban, right? They were not able to subdue the Ansar Allah. And now again, you're going into tropical forests like in Vietnam because you think it's going to be a cakewalk there. Maybe not. It may well be that Maduro's regime falls easily, but 100%, whatever regime you install there is not going to have a single day of peace. because there's going to be an insurgency, and the Venezuelans have been preparing for this. The widespread perception on the Venezuelan side is that the Yankees came to take their oil, their resources.
Yes, yes.
And so there's going to be a good segment of the population which is armed, like they have, territorial defense units and stuff, of millions of armed people are going to be prepared to go underground and to defend. And so you're going to get an insurgency that's going to be constantly attacking the government in Caracas and their supporters and the CIA and American advisors and American corporates and so forth. So there's not going to be peace. It's not going to you're going to remove Maduro and then, everybody's going to get to live happily ever after. It's going to be a mess. It's going to turn Venezuela into a Congo or Libya or, one of these types of places where it's just going to be shit to forever.
Yeah.
And so that's the most likely outcome, even in the best case scenario. Worst case scenario, you get like a Vietnam or an Afghanistan where you waste trillions upon trillions of resources and thousands of U.S. servicemen lives, and you get essentially nothing out of it. You have to hightail, and then some other Maduro comes and takes over.
Mm-hmm.
And then, to do that exactly in the run-up to midterm elections, which are, make or break for the whole Trump revolution, it would be a spectacular own goal. And even suppose that everything goes perfectly, it's like the perfectly engineered regime change operation. American people never voted for this. American people didn't ask to take over the government in Caracas. They don't care about this, and they might resent that what they did ask about is normal wars, but they got a brand new one with a brand new enemy. So it might backfire even if everything goes great, because people will say, you betrayed us. We voted for no more wars and you gave us another war. And the fact that it's been successful, we didn't ask for it. Nobody asked for it. In fact, I think that last polls, 70% of Americans oppose the interventions, and only a minority, 30%, are in favor.
Mm-hmm.
Once servicemen start returning in flag-draped coffins, there's going to be more opposition and less support still. And so why would you do that? That would be super dumb. That would be just so dumb that I don't think that people in Trump administration are dumb. I really don't. And in fact, I know that they're not. So I suspect that they're not going to do this, but that they are going to apply maximum pressure to the Maduro regime for some reason that we can only guess what it is.
Fair enough. I agree with you that it will be dumb. You have my complete agreement that this would be utterly insane. And yet here we are, right? There's a huge
but on the other hand, Jamal, do you know how long this has been going on?
Yeah, it's been 20, 30 years. I mean, ever since the
No. I mean, this, Trump moving military assets to the Caribbean. And
right. It's been a slow move, right?
Yeah. So it started in the first half of September of this year.
Mm-hmm.
So we're now it's been more than 10 weeks. No attack, no war, no invasion.
Just threats.
I think it's some kind of dog and pony show for reasons that we might find out about or we might not find out about, but it's not what they're telling us that it is.
One last thing before you leave that I want to get your take on is this 28-point peace plan. Witkoff was in Moscow having a conversation with Putin. I think this is a dead letter, but you may have a different take on this than I do.
You mean the 28-point peace plan?
Yeah, because there are so many elements of that plan that are just non-starters. But the fact that it exists is a positive, because at the very least, it's a recognition of what's taking place on the ground militarily and Ukraine's collapse at some point. But give me your take on this. I mean, do you see it that way?
certain elements of that plan are extremely encouraging. And so, the idea is not to get a ceasefire. The idea is to address the root causes of the conflict. So those root causes are abundantly addressed in that 28-point peace plan. Namely, Ukraine would have to commit to becoming a neutral nation and not to become a member of any Western military alliance like NATO. They would have to enshrine this principle into their constitution, which would be one of the main elements that the Russians have been demanding since 2007, practically, for Ukraine not to become member of NATO. Then the Russians would have to commit not to attack any other Western nations in Europe. And not only that, the Russians would have to enshrine that into their legislature, into their laws of the land. And if that happened, the important aspect of that is that it would immediately take credibility from those people in Europe who are crying, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. If the Russians pass a law, no invasions to the West, no military actions past Ukraine, then all of those voices will have to, fall silent, or they will lose all credibility completely. So that, in effect, what that does is it forces a complete change of Europe's security architecture. It will pull the rug from under the warmongers in Europe completely. And then, it addresses things like uprooting racist, Nazi ideologies, introducing educational programs to promote tolerance. It talks about creating a fund for reconstruction of Ukraine, into which the Russians will invest $100 billion, and the Europeans would have to invest $100 billion, and it would be managed jointly by the Americans and the Russians. And it's explicitly stated that the fund would be used beyond just, reconstruction of Ukraine, and that its objective would be to deepen the bilateral relationship. It doesn't say between whom, but it's obvious that it's between the United States and Russia. Now, people might say, like, oh yeah, Russians want their money back. Why should they give Ukraine $100 billion of their own money? It's not in Russia's interest to have a rump impoverished, Nazi-infested nation on their border. It's in their interest to have a stable, prosperous, cooperative Ukraine on their borders, kind of like Belarus today, a country that's a economic partner, that's a trade partner, and a stable democratic regime where people live good lives. When people are prosperous, they're not inclined to go to war, which is why, the Western nations who manipulated Ukraine into war first had to completely destroy their economy. In 2014, the average salary in Ukraine was something like $129 a month. It was, and so if you have a well-ordered, developed, prosperous nation that it's applied to rebuilding of their economy, then you take down the risk of war in the near future. So the Russians will be very much interested in that fund taking shape. Contrary to the European proposal, the European proposal is we take the money away from the Russians, we do the reconstruction and development of Ukraine, meaning, we take Russian assets as collateral, then our banks extend loans to Ukraine and they spend that money on our corporations to, do whatever reconstructions that we decide. And then, at some point we finagled some kind of a armistice deal where basically we impose reparations on the Russians.
Right.
And we say, oh, guess what? Those reparations, they work out exactly to this money that we have frozen, so we'll just take that.
We just take your money. We just steal your cash.
The American proposal is very different because Russia becomes an active participant, and the investment into Ukraine is Russian investment into Ukraine, not European investment backed by Russian frozen collateral. So all those, and then, the territorial questions, the Russians have never been particularly hung up on territories because they're not obsessed with colors on the maps and how much territory they took. They're obsessed with security, with destroying the military capability of their enemy, destroying the ideologies that turn a whole nation against Russia. And from there, their idea is we want a friendly government in Kiev. Once they have a friendly government in Kiev, they can gain some control over the country through administrative means, business deals and investments, and measures like demanding accountability, opening Ukraine to Russian investigators, to Russian court cases, influencing their policies by backing political factions. Like you back this political candidate, they run for election, maybe they get into power, then you gain influence. You don't have to go to war for that, and this is basically how the Brits do it. And so I think that the Russians have been learning. You don't have to march your troops into every city to take control of it. You can take control of it administratively. And I think that this is what the Russian long-term plan is.
Alex, man, I always appreciate these conversations. I really do. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and greetings to your listeners and viewers.
Oh, well, yeah, they always appreciate you too. Absolutely. Alex Krainer. He is founder of Krainer Analytics and creator of iSystem Trends Following. He worked as a market analyst, researcher, trader, and hedge fund manager going back to 1996. He has authored several books, including Mastering Uncertainty in Commodities Trading, The Grand Deception, and Alex Krainer's Trend Following Bible. Man, thank you for this. You be safe, okay? Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too. Bye, Jamal.
Have a good one. Bye-bye. All right. I see my man in the background. I have been eagerly awaiting and looking forward to this conversation, the one and only John Helmer. How you doing, John? You doing okay this evening?
Very well. Thank you for having me back.
No, absolutely. John Helmer, he's the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia, one of the only Western journalists to direct his own independent bureau, absent national or commercial ties. He is one of the most widely read Russian specialists in Russian business, in the business world, and for news, breaking stories on Russian base and precious minerals. I have followed Dancing with Bears for a while. This is the website.
Dances with Bears. That's its real
what
name.
is it? Dancing. I'm sorry. Dances with Bears. Thank you.
Yeah.
It is a great site. This has been something that I've read for the last, I guess, several months. And so I always appreciate you joining me on this. You have a learned point of view. And I say that with all sincerity. I had the opportunity to read, obviously Putin and Witkoff met, I guess it was yesterday. And so the readout from that is, there's a lot of political language around it, but basically we haven't gone backwards. We didn't necessarily talk about these things in detail, even though we did talk about, let's say, the overarching objective of what we want in Russia, which effectively means nothing. Nothing has changed, right? The war continues. We will continue a military operation on the ground. You pointed out something in your article in Dances with Bears that Putin said in regards to the Europeans. Effectively, look, if the Europeans are willing to start a war, then we are prepared for that war.
Mhm.
What is going on with this negotiation, or does this negotiation have any merit associated with it at all, or is this just purely political language?
Oh, well, let's try and take the little bits of a very big day yesterday, Tuesday, December 2, apart,
Yeah.
Jamal, because for some reason or other, neither the mainstream media nor the alt media nor even the podcasters are looking at the evidence. Yesterday was a very big day for three different reasons in Moscow. The first was, as you said, there was the meeting between President Putin, his assistant Yuri Ushakov, and the emissary for business, Kirill Dmitriev, with Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner. That was only one of the big meetings. At the same time as they were meeting in the Kremlin, Foreign Minister Lavrov was meeting Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, who had earlier that day had meetings at the Security Council of Russia. That's the Politburo, the top collective decision-making body of the country, headed by Sergei Shoigu and former President Dmitry Medvedev. And at the same time, or a few hours before, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, briefed Indian reporters on the approaching meeting. President Putin will go to Delhi on Thursday, December 4, and meet with Prime Minister Modi December 4 to December 5. So what we have, and let me take it apart if we've got the time, each of three major meetings occurred. Now, the mainstream media totally ignored the China meeting and the India meeting, but we'll come to those in a minute. The second part of what they've missed is very clearly things were different. And what I've proposed to do is to just go through the small print of what Yuri Ushakov said when he briefed the press after the 5-hour meeting with Witkoff and Kushner. These are things that Ushakov has never really said before. The first thing, there are 4 points. The first thing is Ushakov doesn't usually say, we disagree with the other side. He's a mouthpiece. He's a presidential assistant. He's an advisor on foreign affairs. He doesn't have the ambition and possibly not the brains of a Kissinger, a Brzezinski, what our US audience understands as a national security advisor. He's not quite that. He's not powerless, but he doesn't have that role. He doesn't disagree usually, but yesterday he did. He explicitly said, there are points on which we don't agree. The president, referring to Putin, of course, is critical of some parts. Second, he said, I've got to flip my paper so I can read it for you. He said there's no compromise. He was asked, what compromise have you reached on the main issues, territorial issue, and that was the basic fundamental issue in discussion. And a question was asked by a journalist, in what context was any compromise reached? And Ushakov said, no compromise option has yet been found. However, some of the American proposals appear to be more or less acceptable. They do nevertheless require further discussion. Certain wording we've been offered is not suitable for us. This is far more negative and critical than Ushakov has been in this negotiation for the last 3 years. That's the first point. Somehow or other, the entire media and Russia experts in the podcasts, CIA specialists on Russia, MI6 specialists on Russia who broadcast in the US, they missed it. I don't know how that's possible, but they did. Okay, number 2, Ushakov says there have been no business deals here. There's no, he implies, no discussion of sanctions war, no clear understanding from the on the Russian side, from the Trump side, how sanctions will come off, how economic warfare will come off. Let me tell you exactly how he said it. It's subtle, but it's there. He says, we specifically discussed territorial issues. I'm quoting Ushakov from the Kremlin website, without which the crisis cannot be settled. So territorial issues, fundamental. Of course, we also talked about the broad prospects for future economic interaction between our countries. Incidentally, he said, a great deal has been said on that issue before as well during our previous meetings. But this time, it's been pointed out that there are vast opportunities for cooperation if we genuinely want this. If we do, it's time to demonstrate a sincere desire for cooperation, both in Moscow and in Washington. Now, what does that mean? It means that the Russian side haven't heard a genuine desire, a sincere desire for cooperation on the economic warfare front. Business deals are discussed. Kirill Dmitriev uses his Twitter account to promote various things, a tunnel under the Bering Strait. The Russian side have talked about resuming flights between Washington and Moscow, New York and Moscow. But basically here, Ushakov is saying, no deals. There's been nothing agreed. And he's implying no sincere interest on the business side or the sanctions war. That's pretty critical. It's pretty fundamental. Then he says, and this is a third point, he was asked by a reporter, what about the 28 points? You were talking to Alex Krainer before. He was talking through the Miami plan, the 28 points. I can hold it up. There are 28 points. But Ushakov says, no, there are 27. Right? Now, I can count. You can count. Everybody's watching can count. If Ushakov, who's read the stuff, says there are 27, and all of us kibitzers outside say there are 28, where's the missing point? What happened?
Plan. Yeah.
Okay. I reckon here's what happened. Point 28 has disappeared. Point 28, I read it to you. Once all parties agree to this memorandum, that's the Miami 28 points, the ceasefire will take effect immediately after both sides retreat to agreed points to begin implementation of the agreement. I reckon that's missing. The Russians have thrown it out. Why? Well, first, because it says the ceasefire will take effect immediately after both sides retreat. Excuse me, Russian army's winning. They're advancing.
Right.
This Miami plan talked about only one country's army retreating. That's the loser of this war, right? That's the Ukraine, backed by the United States, backed by the NATO allies. There's only one retreat here. That's the Ukrainian retreat, at least on paper. So this 28.28 has gone. That's interesting. It's a first indication that Ushakov is telling in detail exactly how they're chopping out points that the American side have brought to the table. Now, here's the fourth point that everybody seems to have missed. That's the presence of Kushner. Who's Kushner? Why is Kushner there? Well, we can talk about that later, but let me point out that when Ushakov refers to the US side, he refers to Mr. Witkoff. But he refers to Kushner as Jared. The Russians are very formal. They use a variety of ways of referring to a person depending on how formal or informal. They might use a diminutive for his first name. They might use his first name. They might use his first name and his patronymic. They might say Mr. Surname. But for Ushakov to refer to Witkoff as Mr. and Kushner as Jared implies what? that the Russian side considers Jared a little boy tagging along with the serious people? Is that what they mean? Or do they mean that they're closer to Jared Kushner because he's member of the Trump family? Either way, the Russians clearly, according to Ushakov, mean something different. Now, there's no sign. You look at all the photographs of Kushner, the man doesn't move his mouth. And there are possible reasons for this. He may have overdosed on Botox, but he can't move his mouth. There's no sign the man talks. There is definitely no photographs available of the two hours he was in camera range outside walking in Moscow, outside the Bolshoi Theater, and then inside the Kremlin. He didn't smile. He didn't talk. There's no sign that his mouth opened. Okay? So why would the Russian side refer to him as Jared informally, in a friendlier way than they referred to Witkoff, who's been in that room negotiating with Putin hours and hours and hours? They don't call him Steve. Okay. So there are 4 points there indicated in the small print of what Yuri Ushakov had to say, which tells me, 4 points tell me, plural, that there were things that were happening there that haven't happened before. The first and major point is there's no agreement on any specific issues. None. Second, the Russian side wants to continue negotiating with Trump, but aren't afraid to let out hints that they're nowhere near the fundamental points of agreement which they thought President Putin had explained to Trump back in August when the Anchorage summit was held. So that's why the Russians keep saying, we base our negotiating stance on the understandings reached in Anchorage. They thought Trump understood what Putin was saying, what the root causes of the conflict are, why ceasefire by itself is unacceptable, and so on and so forth. And now we've seen 4 plans. Miami plan, which you've just discussed, 28 points or 27. Mm-hmm. Within a couple of days, it's cut down to 19 points in Geneva. Then the next day in Abu Dhabi, it's cut further. It's pointless at that point. And now Ushakov says the Americans brought 4 term sheets, new papers to the table, which were looked at. Okay, so quite a lot is happening if you're in the business of selling paper to these guys, and these guys are scribbling paper and covering the table with it, but a lot is not agreed. And what's happening is that the Russian side is clearly saying to its domestic constituency, to the General Staff, the Security Council, and then to the world, it's sticking to its root cause fundamental security points. And it is disappointed with Trump, to use his words for Putin, that there's no serious effort to relieve the economic warfare. No serious, genuine or sincere, those are the words I just quoted from Ushakov, effort by the Americans to address the sanctions war. Okay, the US, the allies, the enemy states from Russian point of view, link sanctions war to military war, to political security, to guarantees. They're all linked in a package. Everybody understands how that works. But the Russian side is saying, okay, you've left out a big chunk of the package here, boys. And that goes to the points 13 and 14 of the Miami plan. Russia does not accept that the $300 billion central bank reserves will be stolen by the Americans, who will decide to put $100 billion of Russian money into the Ukraine, directed by the Americans, and another 200 billion, the other 2/3 of the money, will be invested in a Russia-Ukraine fund, again directed by the Americans. That's called privatization of public property. Russia's been through that. It was a very unpleasant experience, enforced by US advisors, Clinton advisors, and so on. Privatization, that's a nice word, but the Russian side has been clear from March 2022, when the reserves were seized and confiscated, that they are stolen. The confiscation is illegal. And so what we see here is a rather strong failure on the US side to come to the table with an economic plan for eliminating economic warfare. So that's, to sum up, my assessment of what happened between Russia and the United States on Tuesday. We've got more to tell, but let me hear your view about that part.
No, that is a fantastic breakdown. Because I saw the comments about Ushakov, and I didn't quite understand how the point went from 28 to 27. It was very political language in a way that the language is effectively used. No, the fantastic breakdown. So what is the point of this plan then? I mean, from my point of view, it was the U.S. on some level recognized what was happening on the ground, that they said, oh my God, the Ukraine military is effectively collapsing.
Yes.
Their ability to maintain on the battlefield is depreciating by the day.
Yes.
Cross has just fallen. Volchance has just fallen, or liberated, depending upon your point of view. Like, these are canary in the coal mine, not to mention $50 billion in debt, political turmoil. Okay, we need to do something. Hence, out comes this 28-point plan. So what is the point of the plan then, if the plan is not from a legitimate way of trying to end the conflict? What are the Americans trying to do with this?
Well, I think we said it last time, Jamal. Trump's retreating. Trump is entirely committed to winning against easy targets and not losing against serious targets. It is essential for the Trump administration and the president personally not to appear to be losing, and to remind everyone of his words on the deck of the USS Harry Truman on the 250th birthday of the US Navy a few weeks back. He said, "We win. We've won the World War I. We won World War II. We won everything after. We won everything before. We would have won the Vietnam War if we tried harder. We would have won the Afghanistan War if Biden had balls. If not for political correctness, we would go on winning, and I'm winning by making peace between all these countries. And I'm got now a difficult one," says Trump. I'm trying to use his language. The Russia-Ukraine war is a difficult one, but what is really happening is he's attempting to make his strategic retreat from that battlefield profitable, because if the Europeans want to continue to fight, they'll have to buy the weapons from the United States. He wants to continue the war against Russia, but not appear to lose on the battlefield in the Ukraine. For that, he's forced the NATO allies to commit to 5% of GDP spending, most of which is to be committed to the United States military industry. The war will continue with Russia, but the platform, the Ukraine platform, will be supplanted by the Polish one, the Baltic one, the Finnish one, and so on, in a program of sequencing of war in which the US will get cracking on increasing the pressure on China. That's one of its big war commitments. Second, its big war commitment to overthrow the regime in Iran, the Israeli-American war in the south of Russia. And finally, we all know that the US is committed to regime change in Venezuela And they're making quite a big show of that one in an attempt to destroy the Maduro presidency. So I don't see the US or Trump personally giving up war with Russia, but rather covering, camouflaging, sending out, kicking up sand in everyone's eyes as it tries to disguise the loss, the defeat you mentioned in the Ukraine. It would like to prevent the total annihilation, the capitulation of the Ukrainian forces. It wants to assure that there's something left. Trump has a chat instead of intelligence briefing. This is a president who can't read. We've talked about that before. He likes pictures. He gets one of these picture shows called an intelligence briefing once a week, if then. But he has every week a very important lunch. That's with Vice President Vance. That's where the brains are. And the brains say, why don't I send my man, that's Army Secretary, I believe his name is Daniel Driscoll, to the Ukrainian, to Kiev, and we'll let them know that they simply have to agree to our terms right now. So Driscoll takes two very serious active officers, General George, who's the Army Chief of Staff. He's operational. He's not a retiree like General Kellogg. He's not a war loser like General Kellogg was in his career. George is a serious operational officer, and he brings along General Donahue, who's the U.S. Army Commander, Europe, Central Asia, another serious guy. And you see them at the table with Driscoll. Driscoll's very young, just out of short pants by diplomatic standards. But these two generals, and they've been accompanied by a couple others in the back of the room, tell Zelensky, it's over. We can't defend you from what's coming. So you want to fight on, you'll die. But you'll die in a way that we will make sure you will be. So sign our terms of agreement and save yourselves. We'll help you save yourselves. We will help preserve what's left of the Ukraine. We will even try to pressure the Russians to make certain concessions. That was the message, right? It was unique only in the sense that until then, Trump had been sending the loser, General Kellogg, and he would simply come back with what the Europeans and Zelensky told him to tell Trump and ignore the fact that they were facing an escalating military defeat. So Driscoll and the generals have delivered the black spot. If everyone's read Treasure Island, the pirate chief sends a black spot in the Bible to tell the person, it's over, you're dead. We're going to finish you off if you don't agree to whatever the terms are in the pirate camp. That's the black spot. Those are serious individuals. They delivered the black spot to Zelensky, and he keeps trying to avoid the inevitable. And the Europeans help him for a different purpose. But so what the Trump administration is doing is to put a hard word on the Ukrainians and the Europeans. Trump has said it before. If you guys want to keep fighting, it's okay with me. You'll pay me. It won't cost me a penny. I'm out. I'm not going to lose this one. So what's the plan? You asked me, Jamal. Well, the plan is the other side of the black spot, the death notice. The plan is, here's the plan to get the Russians to leave you alive, leave you guys alive. Now, it looks very strange, this plan. When you look at what the Russians side says, first, there's territorial issues. Second, there's demilitarization. Third, there's denazification. There's three fundamental parts of the plan. We could talk about a couple other bits and pieces. Obviously, the fourth part, sanctions war. We mentioned that. Take demilitarization. We know that back in March, April 2022, when the Ukrainians and the Russians agreed in Istanbul on a ceasefire plus security guarantees plus end of war, the Russian side said your demilitarized army will be 85,000. The Ukrainians said, oh no, we want 220,000. 85, 225. What we now know is that the American plan, in its Geneva aspect, has gone from 600,000 to 800,000. 800,000, and the Abu Dhabi version probably has no limit at all. What we know from the March-April 2022 plan was there was an annex, I've got it somewhere sitting behind me, in which each of the weapon systems Ukraine was permitted to have after the conflict would be so limited in numbers. There was a disagreement between the Russian side wanting a smaller number, the Ukrainian side wanting a bigger number, but the range was limited. These were forces, weapons, ordnance that could not reach Russia to attack either the new regions or the hinterland. Now, all we know about these plans, the Miami plan, the Geneva plan, the Abu Dhabi plan, is that the range capability of Ukrainian drones and missiles is vastly greater than it was in 2022. So the Russian commitment, the Russian term sheet insists that there be a demilitarized zone in which the weapons, long-range weapons, are entirely removed. There must be no foreign forces firing them, British units, American units, German units, and what have you, and no form of NATO warfare going on or NATO war intelligence, including US intelligence. All of these things are required for a military settlement. And Driscoll plus George plus Donahue are quite capable of meeting with the Russian generals, including Igor Kostyakov, the head of the military intelligence service of Russia, who has been in part of the negotiating team in Istanbul last time round, to work out a detailed annex. But we're nowhere near that. And you don't send a boy called Jared and a man you call Mr. Witkoff to the Kremlin to discuss the details of that. There's not only territorial issues, there's demilitarization issues. Then there's the denazification problem. You mentioned it. It's to end the race hatred motivation that fuels the endless belief on the Ukrainian side that Russia must be destroyed. The Slavs are a racial enemy, they're racial inferior, pretty much the same things that Adolf Hitler believed, and for which the Ukraine was a collaborator in the last World War. Denazification has to come along with elections to change the regime so people get to vote on whether they like the Azov version of race hatred of Russia or whether they're genuinely interested in some sort of peaceful accommodation. That's the elections. Second, there has to be de jure definition of territorial limits. De jure means in law, the United States will recognize the new Russian territories. If you have no de jure recognition, but just practical, this is where the army stopped, then denazification can't work. There will always be a Ukrainian group that wants to return the territories. As a practical matter, you might call them terrorist groups, you might call them the Operation Gladio stay-at-home units, who will, for the next generation or 2 or 3 or 4, plan to recover the eastern Ukraine, pretty much as the Balts attempted all the way through the Soviet period to recover what they thought they were, their independence, and so forth and so on. So without de jure recognition in the plan, and it's not, you don't get denazification to work. You can have elections, but the new president, whether it's Poroshenko to come back or Zaluzhny to come from London, or it's Beletsky, the Azov general, whoever it is, it might even be Zelensky, unless they give up formal legal recognition, Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, we have continuing war. This is just a postponement. Now, what's the Russian position?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm in a flow here. The Russian position announced before Witkoff and Kushner showed up in the Kremlin was announced by Peskov when he was asked a question by one of the Indian reporters at 12 noon in Moscow, 5 hours before Witkoff arrived. And Peskov clearly said, we aim to have an end of war that will last for all the generations. He didn't have to say that means no ceasefire. That means a pause for refreshment. It doesn't mean we stop fighting now. We give them an army of 800,000 plus. We fill up their country again with brand new weapons. He didn't mean that. It means a peace for all the generations. Who's he talking to? He's talking to the Russian voters. That's what they insist on. That's where we are.
So the war continues. I mean, for all intents and purposes. I mean, and I guess the reason why I asked the question before about what is the point of this plan and is because it's clear that's on the ground. Ukraine is not faring well. I mean, they're going to lose Donbass within the course of at least 6 months. And so it's almost like the plan is offering something that the Russians are going to take within 6 months anyway.
Yes, I agree with you. Were you asking me a question here then?
Well, yeah, I guess from the Russian point of view, the war just continues. Like, meaning they're going to accomplish their objectives militarily. This peace stuff is a fig leaf for all intents and purposes, meaning are they even open to negotiations in real terms? Like, how would they even get what they want in a negotiation? How would you even trust the U.S.? You've had Minsk agreements 1 and 2. You've had the Istanbul agreements. None of those things were legitimate. How would they even get what they want over a negotiating table? It seems like they would have to deal with this militarily. Or am I wrong in this?
Well, I agree with you, Jamal, that there is a serious problem of trust on both sides, but certainly from a Russian point of view, the victor in a war doesn't give the other side the opportunity to come back and hit more fiercely than and revive the war. That just doesn't happen. It didn't happen in the Treaty of Versailles to Germany. Germany was limited to naval vessels less than 10,000 tons. It was limited to, it had a curtailed air force. A whole list of an annex of the Versailles Treaty listed all the munitions that were capped for the German army. And if I'm not mistaken, it was limited to 100,000 men. And it had territorial occupation by the French in the west of Germany, and it lost its territorial possessions in the east to Poland and so on, and to Czech Republic and so on. All that meant was that Hitler wanted to take it back and tried to later on after rebuilding his army. The Versailles plan or precedent can't be repeated. The Russians are not going to allow it. So I agree, it's a fig leaf. The American side is offering fig leaves, but the Russian side says, sure, we'll negotiate with your fig leaves, but we want you're going to have to allow us to take the figs. We'll let you parade around making peace. We will endorse President Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize next year, but there are fundamentals here. And there's no sign from Ushakov's version this time round that Witkoff and Kushner are putting on the table a serious resolution of terms, military political, economic terms and territorial terms, which can be trusted. Your question, Jamal, which can be trusted because of the way they're to be enforced. There's no sign of that. On the other hand, Ushakov is saying, we're going to continue to negotiate with President Trump. We hope Mr. Witkoff and Jared will take our message back again, and we will reinforce the understandings of Anchorage. They're trying. Why? That's another good question you asked me. Well, all politicians start by talking to their domestic electorate. All of them. Russia too. Russia's a democracy too. And President Putin is addressing Russian people and saying, look, I'm trying to negotiate with these guys. The Russian polls show that a very large, somewhere around 40% of Russians currently think the US is a bigger enemy to Russia than the Ukraine is. The Russian people insist on negotiations. But if negotiations fail, Putin is saying, it's not my fault, I've tried. And critics of Putin inside Russia say, you're trying too hard. You're making too many concessions. There's that line of thinking. Why don't you let the army finish them off and do it quicker? That we don't need to go into the details, but that's a very serious, popular argument. It's in the press. It's also in the minds of voters who get polled. Yes, there is a very strong view like that among older men, Russian men. It's not a Russian woman's idea. This is in the polls. I'm not making this up. Yeah. So Putin is at first priority delivering to Russian people this week. One, I'm doing my best. I'm bending over backwards with Mr. Witkoff and Jared. Whatever Trump sends me, I'm doing my best. But they have to accept our fundamental root cause issues of security. He's also demonstrated this week that he's gone to the Joint Military Command Post and he's doing his best to help the army win this war. Now, President Putin's poll popularity, trust in his performance, confidence in his handling of Russian affairs is directly correlated with Russian confidence in the Russian army. If that army begins to lose, President Putin's standing will drop. Mm-hmm. It's a correlation there, strict. So President Putin must show, I'm doing my best to negotiate with the Americans. I'm doing my best to support our boys on the front to win this war and justify the sacrifice because it's been a big one. So this is where it is.
One last question on this. Does this mean, if necessary, going to the Polish border? Because it seems that the United States is deal adverse. Like the faculty of being able to sit down and actually hammer out a negotiation seems to have eroded with the US becoming a hegemon. Like this is not something we normally do. Like we dictate, we tell countries to do X or Y. Well, we have no cards in this. So this is a different animal. So the best that you get is effectively Witkoff coming up with deals that are just clownish. It's amateur hour. If we are deal adverse, meaning a U.S. president not being able to accept a deal, even with the Ukrainian military collapsing, does it mean that the Russian military has to go to the Polish border?
I don't think so, Jamal. The Russian general staff can demilitarize the Ukraine short of going to the to the Polish border. It can cut the Ukraine off from Poland and from the resupply at Rzeszów, which is in the southeastern corner of Poland, which is the hub into which aircraft come, deliver weapons, trains come, deliver weapons, which are then moved by train or truck across the border. The Russian capability has long been there to cut that supply link. President Putin has restricted that. That's why NATO officials can grandstand by taking the train to Kiev, getting off and shaking hands with Zelensky. That train could be cut off. That hasn't happened yet. Russia doesn't want or need to occupy all of the Ukraine. It does want to make sure that NATO doesn't turn Poland into a new platform with nuclear-capable aircraft, F-16s, F-35s, based in forward positions in Poland, beginning to threaten Russia. That's been warned already. Russia doesn't want to see that form of extension of the war, but knows it's coming. I mean, Trump is not shy of committing US troops, weapons, aircraft to new deployment in Poland on top of the existing Aegis battery in northwest Poland, about which Russia has already said that's because it's nuclear capable, because it's at short distance from Moscow, for example, or St. Petersburg. It's a potential nuclear threat that the Russian side will have to counter either in nuclear terms or with the Oreshnik. So the ability, let's say, strategically to create a standoff, a mutual deterrence between Russia and Poland, between Russia and NATO reinforcements all the way up to Finland, for example. That capability is now being built. That's the continuing part of Trump's and the NATO war against Russia. But for the time being, the solution to the battlefield of the Ukraine is the four regions plus Crimea. That basically takes Russia to the Dnieper River. On the other side of the Dnieper River, demilitarizing such that the rump Ukrainian state cannot have the equipment, the intelligence sharing, and the capability to attack Russia again, and a change of regime in Kiev that would not want to encourage that. That leaves Ukraine as a potential terrorist platform for the future, against which the Russian side is regretfully having to figure out what to do, but not to go to the Polish border to occupy all of the Ukraine, unnecessary to achieve Russia's security objectives.
The other conversations that took place was between Wang Yi and Sergei Lavrov. And
Yes.
as you pointed out, there were questions apparently with Indian representatives, as Putin is going to be going to
Yes.
India to speak with Modi on December 4th, I believe.
Yes.
Let's go to Modi first. I'm fascinated with the Modi conversation. There's been all sorts of talk in the West that India
Yes.
isn't going to stop using Russian oil. India is that the U.S. is trying to pressure Russia to sell its oil companies. Like all of this
Yes.
talk about it, effectively saying this is going to be the thing that injures Russia in regards to the war. What's the reality of this? Why is he going to have the conversation with Modi? What is the main thrust of that conversation?
Well, I was in Delhi last week and had the opportunity to meet press colleagues. I did a couple of podcasts, which our audience can look at in Delhi itself, answering questions from very competent Indian journalists and analysts. And I've also met a variety of Indian sources, all of whom raise a number of interesting questions. On the oil issue, the Indian side is going to buy oil at a price that suits the Indian economy best. And that's why it began to buy more oil in the past couple of years than it had in the past. what the Indian side sees is that that Trump's sanction against dealing with Rosneft and Lukoil as suppliers of crude oil is essentially unilaterally a Trump punishment for Modi, a US punishment for India, because while it's allegedly a universal sanction, Trump has already exempted Xi Jinping and the Chinese from that sanction. He's clearly said he's going to let the oil flow to China because they need it in the northern parts of the country, he said. Second, Trump isn't sanctioning Turkey for buying Russian oil and processing it and refining it and then reselling it to Europe as petroleum products. So Turkey and China are clearly exempted. Why India? Why push India? So India and the Modi government feels that it's more vulnerable to US attack than China is. It's less capable of counter-threatening. It's got a tariff, an economic tariff punishment that it needs to resolve with a trade deal, a counter-tariff trade deal that Trump will accept. And that's a lot. That's been very carefully negotiated for months, and it may succeed. But the perception on the Indian side is that there's been a serious pivot by the United States against India on oil, but that's much less problematic for the Indians than the American pivot to Pakistan. Let's remember that India has fought several wars against Pakistan, defeating them each time. The most recent was this year. Trump has made a public fantasy of his role in achieving a ceasefire with Pakistan. Pakistan was defeated. I know that there's a big audience out there that wants to see Pakistan as another Muslim victim like the Palestinians suffering from the American-Israeli genocide. This is not the case, never been the case with Pakistan. Pakistan's military has always acted under CIA guidance until this brief period of relationship with China. The war against India that was stimulated by a Pakistan-driven terrorist incident in Kashmir produced retaliation that nearly destroyed all of Pakistan's command control. So Pakistan was saved by the ceasefire arrangement that Marshal Munir negotiated with Vance, and has solidified by a variety of economic deals, lobbying deals, and plain bribery to put the United States once again in the driving seat of all the Pakistan war-making platforms, aiming at Pakistan's western border against Iran, aiming at Afghanistan, and aiming again at India. So India understands that the US is becoming again a strategic prompter, a strategic threat behind Pakistan. So India faces a China problem about which there's violence, about which there's military engagement in the Himalayas in the northeast. It faces in the west a US-driven Pakistan warfighting platform. It faces the potential for threat in the Indian Ocean to the south. India has a very capable and very experienced military machine, and it wants to know about Russia, its long-term strategic ally. Can we rely on you if there's another war or a conflict in our west from Pakistan and the United States? Can we rely on you if there's a clash in the northeast between our forces and the Chinese. Now, think about that strategically. It's a very serious, pressing Indian concern, and President Putin's going to be asked this question by Prime Minister Modi. Why do I know that? Because the journalists on yesterday asked Peskov. Now, I'll just read you what they asked. I'm wandering a bit away from the oil question because essentially the oil question is minor. It's subordinate to the bigger strategic question that the Indians need to ask and will ask President Putin. What the journalist said during Peskov's briefing, I'll put the links up on my Dances with Bears so that our audience can watch the questions put to Peskov.
And I'll put the article below also.
Yeah. So the journalist from India Today said, look, Mr. Peskov, we see you, Russia, have a deepening, I'm part quoting the words, deepening no limits partnership with China. He says, this is exactly the question. Can Russia give an undertaking in private or in public that in a crisis between China and India, Russia would not tilt decisively towards Beijing? That was the question. And believe it or not, Peskov didn't know how to answer it, wasn't prepared. Now, that's
a difficult question, by the way. I'm sorry to interrupt. That is a very difficult question, especially with the relationship between Russia and China.
You're right. And in my week in Delhi, the question came up in many ways. And I was asked the same question, but I won't bore you with my answer. Let me tell you how Peskov, speaking for President Putin, introducing the visit card, so to speak, to the Indian press before Putin arrives on Thursday, how he answered. Well, he answered all over the place. We enjoy a very high level of cooperation with China, he says. That I'm quoting, the same stand we have with India. We are ready to go as far as India is ready. Excuse me, what's that mean? What does that mean in answer to the question? Are you willing to give us the undertaking you won't side with our enemy if we are at war with China? That isn't to say India wants a war with China. They don't. China is one of the largest trading partners with India. There are multiplying opportunities right now because China has lost its position in Pakistan, been replaced by the United States, and there is a strategic opportunity for India and China to bury the hatchet. Okay, we don't need to go down that path unless there are folks out there who want to say that I'm wrong about Pakistan, I'm wrong about the war, and so on and so on. Fine, we can have that discussion another time. Right now, the issue from an Indian point of view was asked of the Russian side. Will you give us an undertaking that you will not tilt decisively towards China? And so what happened is that Mr. Peskov, who had every opportunity to anticipate this question, failed to answer it. He says, the same stand with India. We are ready to go as far as India is ready. Well, he's referring to the defense relationship between India and Russia. India and Russia will be discussing whether the Indian Air Force will be equipped with Sukhoi 57s, the latest Russian multi-role fighter that the Russian side has been offering to sell with technology transfer and so forth to the Indian Air Force. At the same time, the French are bidding to sell other aircraft, and both sides, and there are other bidders in this race too, are willing to offer price discounts, technology transfer, local production offsets, all that stuff. In addition, India is negotiating to receive the top line S-500 anti-aircraft missile defenses, and the scope, depth, significance of Indian-Russian military defense cooperation is long-standing, many, many years. It's based on mutual understandings, training, cooperation, coordination. It's not a flash in the pan. It's not currently, it's not brand new. But for Peskov to say we are ready to go as far as India is ready implies that India should buy more Russian and and therefore buy, as it were, an insurance policy that Russia should not tilt decisively towards China. It sounds a bit Trump-like, doesn't it?
It's a hard question to answer. I mean, like, the relationship between China and Russia at this point, especially in the context of the war, has been very close, especially in the context of China, let's say, purchasing Russian oil and those type of things.
True.
To turn around and answer that question with a flat yes or no alienates the other country. It's a difficult question.
Right. And that's why, great cue, Jamal, you just cued me to talk about the meetings that Wang Yi had in Moscow, also yesterday, because there's some very strange things seem to have occurred. Let me finish on the Indian side for any Indians in our audience by saying that Peskov did, by a display of hands and pieces of paper on his desk, mean to say that China is a strategic partner of Russia, India is a strategic partner of Russia, both China and India, ancient civilizations, old countries. We look forward, he said, to their achieving more cooperation strategically, and we will try to strike a balance between them. But he did it in such a ham-handed, ham-fisted way, he would have left the Indian side thinking, to that serious question, he wasn't ready to give a serious answer. And that's a serious deficit if you're trying to introduce your president to your prime minister to discuss that very problem. So what do we conclude? How can the Russian side be so unready to answer that big question for India the day before President Putin arrives? How can they be that clumsy? Is that the correct interpretation of Peskov's press conference with the Indians yesterday? Well, we can argue pros and cons, but it wasn't a performance generating trust and confidence. And that was the question. Now let's look at what happened when Wang Yi goes to Moscow yesterday. Again, mass media haven't reported this much. This is running in parallel with the Americans. Why is our alt media and podcasters so preoccupied with the United States they don't understand or follow that Russia has strategic relations with China on the deck yesterday, strategic relations with India on the deck yesterday? What are we as podcasters? Are we also hegemonic about the United States? Is that the only country in the world that should count?
I would say I brought this up yesterday. I had an Asian guest yesterday, and I asked very specifically, why is Wang Yi meeting with Lavrov at the exact same time that Witkoff is meeting with Peskov? So I would like to give myself some flowers on this. I did bring this up.
No. I think all credit to you, Jamal, because you're doing what the others don't do. As we said, where's the ex-CIA man and the ex-MI6 man who are supposed to understand how all these bits and pieces work together? Well, nowhere to be seen. They allow themselves to be US-centric, American-centric, as if the world is focused only on the boy Jared and Mr. Witkoff. That wasn't all that was happening in Moscow yesterday. Okay, so what we have is a very strange combination of Russian reports. Wang Yi went first to the Security Council chaired by Sergei Shoigu and ex-president Dmitry Medvedev. And the Chinese issued a readout of that meeting. The Russians didn't. I'm looking at a side so I can read it. The readout appears in the South China Morning Post and some other places. And the emphasis Wang Yi gives in the readout are, quote, China and Russia have reached a high degree of strategic consensus on issues related to Japan and jointly oppose the revival of Japanese militarism. Wang and Shoigu had comprehensive and in-depth exchanges on major issues concerning the strategic security interests of both countries and concluded their talks with mutual trust strengthened. Quotes, the two sides conducted strategic alignment on issues related to Japan, reaching a high degree of consensus. They agreed to resolutely uphold the outcomes of World War II victory, firmly oppose any attempts to whitewash colonial aggression, and resolutely counter any attempts to revive fascism or Japanese militarism. Nothing there about the Ukraine war. Niche of nothing about the Ukraine war, which is a Russian priority. Yes, the Russians are very concerned with Japanese militarism, the revival of the Japanese. They're breaking the end of war settlement that capped their self-defense force. They're becoming a spearhead, a war-fighting platform for the United States against Russia and China. Yes, Japan is a priority for China and Russia, but that's all the conversation that was recorded in Minister Wang's morning work. So let's see. In the afternoon, he drives over to the foreign ministry to meet Minister Lavrov. There's no mention of Japan in the foreign ministry's public account of what they were talking about. That's a bit odd. It's not very far from the Security Council offices of the foreign ministry in Moscow, but it's like a strategic world change between the two places. So let's hear what Lavrov had to say, if you don't mind. Listen to this. This is remarks prepared by the foreign minister of Russia receiving the foreign minister of the strategic ally China. Quotes, I hope that today's meeting will offer us an opportunity to have a trust-based conversation. This is the way friends must communicate, to go over all these matters and outline specific steps for moving forward toward fulfilling our leaders' agreements. Well, I don't know about you, but it sounds pretty defensive to me. Unusually defensive. Is it possible, you might ask, that there are stumbling blocks, disagreements between the two powers, problems of, I don't know, conflicting intention, conflicting action? If so, on what issues? Why would you say, I hope that today's meeting will give us an opportunity to have a trust-based conversation?
That is weird.
Isn't that what they already do? Isn't that what the Strategic Partnership Agreement requires them to have? Didn't Wang Yi say to tell Shoigu, we trust each other? So he drives a couple of kilometers across Moscow, and Lavrov isn't so sure. Okay, that's what Lavrov says. Okay,
that is a very strange statement. Yeah,
right. That's our evidence. This is a podcast, Jamal, in which we talk evidence, facts. Nobody wants to know my opinion. It's worthless. This is just the facts, ma'am. That was the famous old Los Angeles detective show, remember? Anyway, here's the facts. Here's more of the facts. The communique issued by the Russian Foreign Ministry after the Wang Yi meeting. I'll just read a bit of it. On December 2, Foreign Minister Lavrov held talks with Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Moscow. Wang Yi came to Moscow to take part in conjunction with Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu, the 20th round of Russian-Chinese consultations on security. Now, the punchlines. Special emphasis was placed on prospects for resolving the Ukraine crisis based on eliminating the root cause of the conflict and proper consideration of the fundamental interests of the Russian Federation, the situation in the Asia-Pacific region, and other matters of mutual interest. Following the talks, the sides noted, now listen to this, overlapping or close positions on all key bilateral and international issues, which fact serves as foundation for stable, positive dynamics of Russia-China strategic partnership, regardless of the complex geopolitical environment. Now, you don't have to be a literary analyst that gets a PhD in analyzing language to understand that that overlapping or close don't mean identical. They imply disagreement. There are significant points on which the Russians can't get the Chinese to agree. Well, that's a news item, wouldn't you say? So, where are we now?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just telling you the facts. What appears to have happened is that Lavrov and Shoigu, representing Russian policy at the top, have differences with China, which they don't want to disclose, that relate to strategic security, the war in the Ukraine, and China's concerns for its strategic security in the buildup of the US in Japan, Philippines, Taiwan Straits, and so on. What are the differences? I would say, at the very least, this presentation shows there are significant differences on strategic warfighting issues between China and Russia, which the Indian side will be interested to ask Putin to explain. So we're announcing ahead of Putin's visit that our Indian colleagues might pursue this. That's one part. Second, we understand the Indians, when they ask the question, that down in Delhi, down meaning in the south, they think in the north, Russia and China are tilting against India, that Russia favors China. No, China. Trump favors China over India. That's what's happening. But the Indians would like to know, and Mr. Peskov wasn't able to say something convincing or specific or concrete on that issue. Where does this all add up to? Russia couldn't agree with the United States. Russia couldn't agree with China. And Russia couldn't agree with India all in one day. How about that, Jamal? How about that?
Oh, what a complicated mix of relationships.
Isn't it?
And by the way, that flies in the face of the way people think about it. People think China and Russia are like a one-to-one. In the way they think about their geopolitical standing. And I suppose that's not entirely true based on these dialogues. Wow.
Well, they may be right. All they got to do is do better at the evidence than I've just tried to be. I'm happy to be proved wrong. All the folks have got to do is give us better evidence than what we just laid out. That's all.
Well, they clearly don't want to air their differences. But it's strange that they're noting that there are differences, even though they don't want to air their differences. It's interesting. Wow.
Well, from a drafting point of view, let's just suppose that we're all in the keeping secrets business. Wouldn't you say that Mr. Ushakov has done a clearer job of revealing the issues dividing the US side from the Russian side on the current war?
Yes.
Than Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Wang have shown in relation to what China and Russia disagree about on strategic security. And
yes.
a better job than Mr. Peskov has done in answer to the Indian question. Wouldn't you say that if we just looked at the performances, Ushakov speaking for Putin, has made it clearer what the differences are. Of course, we've amplified it, and we've got the help of, pardon me, all of these plans that have surfaced in the Western press. And we've got dozens of us podcasters and analysts on all sides adding evidence to the mix. So I guess we've got help. But we aren't American-centric. You're a US citizen. I'm a US citizen. But we aren't American-centric when we look at the world. Otherwise, we'll all be Mearsheimer students.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So we're not. What we have to understand is from a non-hegemonic position, Russia's relations with each of those three big states in one day show very different pattern of behavior than we think, than we are accustomed to listening to.
Mm-hmm. John, this has been a masterclass. Thank you for this.
Well, we're both students here, Jamal.
Well, I fantastic breakdown. Let me just put it that way then. Fantastic breakdown. No, you've pulled this apart in a way that I guess part of me was confused when I read Witkoff's statements, which I'm glad that you were able to pull apart to kind of explain, give more context to. I didn't see the readout from the Wang Yi Lavrov meeting, so thank you for breaking that down. And I was very curious on what that conversation was going to be about between Putin and Modi. And again, a great breakdown. So you have my complete thanks for this. John Helmer, the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia, the only Western journalist to direct his own independent bureau, national and without national commercial ties. You can check him out on Dances with Bears. It is a fantastic magazine, or let's say, what would you even call that? I mean, I call it a magazine, but it's like an online.
Well, it's long read plus funny cartoons.
Yes, but your analysis on it is sublime. It is fantastic. And again, this is one of those publications that I read anytime you put out a different article on it. So I will put that at the bottom so the audience can check it out for themselves. John, you have a fantastic rest of your day, man. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Jamal. Good to be talking with you. Look forward to coming back again. Thanks.
Oh, absolutely. You're always welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. All
right, John Helmer. He is amazing. If you haven't checked out Dances with Bears, check it out. It is, his analysis on this stuff is just awesome. And he often puts up the interviews that he does on his website also. It is just fantastic. If you're looking for analysis, he's one of the best in the business. All right. We have come to the end. I had difficulty earlier today. Thankfully, secondary computer came in handy. Is holding the line, even though the view of this is a little weird for me. I've removed the updates from the other computer, so by tomorrow that one should be intact. And fantastic guests. I told you it was going to be a power show. Warwick, Alex Krainer, and John Helmer. Alex, God, man, Alex is always wild to me. It is wild to me where you have a conversation with someone and you have very different model of the world. Meaning when you're looking at the world and you're putting together why things happen the way they happen, your models are very different. And I don't see the need to always conflict with them in those models, because we've had those conversations in the past and it would make a boring show if you're just conflicting every show. And yet, like when you're talking about the world in the way that you want it, it's very similar. It's very strange. It's like, hey man, we're sick of these wars. With this financial capitalism is eating away at the United States. The oligarchs and all of these things have been negative outcomes or have negative consequences for the way that the world is effectively operated, et cetera, et cetera. And you're like, yeah, I agree with all that. And then it becomes, and I think Trump is fighting the globalists. And you're like, at that point, it's like, okay, dude, you just lost me. No, the models of the world. And the reason why I bring up stuff like, okay, well, how does your model fit with Venezuela? And it's like, yeah, I don't get that. Yeah. You got to add it into your model. My model includes it because my model just looks at Donald Trump as, I don't think Trump is fighting a globalist. I mean, the man is an oligarch, right? I mean, for all intents and purposes, the big, beautiful bill is going to put the United States trillions of dollars more into debt. And that money is just being extracted from the poor to the rich. But again, that's besides the point. Alex is a fantastic guest. And I don't need him to agree in regard to my point of view. He can have his own point of view, and that's the one I wanted to explore in regards to the show. No, great show. It's a really good show today. It's a really good show. All right. We have come to the end. I want to thank all of you for joining me. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. You can support this content, PayPal, Patreon, Super Chat, Buy Me a Coffee, all of those things help the show, super stickers. I think it said Super Chat already. This show is trying to reach 100,000. The show also wants to get a producer. So definitely like the content. If you find yourself coming back often, know you can always support financially through those other means. And I will see you guys bright and early tomorrow morning with my regular computer as opposed to the stand-in. But shout out to the stand-in. It did God's work. It did God's work today. You guys have a good day. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.